Gandalf in the Hobbits. Yes, he is indeed Gandalf. What they've been hinting at for 2 whole seasons has finally been revealed. Do they actually think that's good storytelling? To continually and constantly wink at the viewer and tease the stranger, the wizard, being Gandalf, or in the same thing with like the Balrog and Durensbane. These things that have been teased and that we can see coming because they've revealed it. They're hinting at it so egregiously for 2 whole seasons. For Gandalf, he's saying lines like Gandalf said, and he's acting like Gandalf, actually. And in this season especially, it was just doubling down on the hinting and the winking that he's Gandalf. And do they actually think that it's good storytelling to reveal finally what we already knew, what you were already hinting at? Is that satisfying to anyone? It's one thing if you wanted it to be a surprise or a revelation and it's a mystery box. They've continued with that kind of style of storytelling and then constantly hinting at this, with the wizard needing to find a Gand, which is a wand, and saying that, well, the name finds you. I can't pick a name will find me. And then the store hobbits, like several episodes ago, say, so he's a grand elf. Like he's bigger than an elf when Nori and Poppy are talking about the stranger. Yeah, he's bigger than an elf. Oh, he's a grand elf then. And they did that again in the finale when he helps the store hobbits and finds his staff. The hobbits name him, well, they call him Grand Elf. Several times they say it. Bye, Grand Elf. Bye, Grand Elf. And he assumes his name, Gandalf. Why wouldn't he just call himself Grand Elf? That's what they called him. I don't get it. It was so painfully obvious from the first episode that it just turned into a slog, waiting for them to finally admit it. We all knew it. Everyone knew it. He said dialogue. He clearly is Gandalf presenting. He is Gandalf. That's what he would look like. Younger, I guess. I don't know why he would be younger, but they have this thing of like having immortal beings be young. Apparently he gets to choose his own name after all. I know, like what? They only referred him as Grand Elf. Grand Elf, Grand Elf, Grand Elf. Gandalf, that's my name. I'm sorry, that's so dumb. You can't help but laugh. Didn't they not even send the wizards anywhere until pretty close to the Lord of the Rings timeline? Yes, according to canon, Gandalf, well, originally all 5 wizards didn't arrive until like year 1000 of the Third Age. And at one point, Tolkien did like revisit it later on. I think it's in the Peoples of Middle-earth text, but that was only in relation and where he talked about the 2 blue wizards having arrived earlier in the Second Age. I think it was year 1600 of the Second Age, and they were instrumental in how the Battle of the Last Alliance happened. They were instrumental in the East and South and having the forces there not overwhelm the free peoples of Middle-earth, and that kind of impacted how the War of the Last Alliance came about. Some people would view that as soft canon because it wasn't in any published works when he was alive. This is stuff that's been accumulated. His notes were accumulated and other things that were published posthumously. I would still consider that as canon because he did mull that over. That was one of his ideas. Any idea and anything that Tolkien wrote, I would consider canon. Did you hear the so-called Tolkien scholar defend the changes in lore? He said there's no such thing as canon. Yes, and that was like immediately Amazon put out this promo the next day that the finale premiered. Amazon had this promo image with Corey Olsen, and the first words out of his mouth were, first thing to specify is there's no such thing as canon in Tolkien. I cannot begin to even describe how wrong that is. So when a literary work is the foundation of an IP, the author's work, the author's words, that's canon. So you can also compare this to the Dune saga. What Frank Herbert wrote, the first 6 Dune books, that's canon. And you wouldn't consider the adaptations that came after, like David Lynch's version of Dune, and then most recently, Denis Villeneuve's 2-film adaptation of Dune. So you technically would not view those as canon, but rather additions to like the greater franchise. And the reason why you can call them or consider them additions to the franchise is because they are guided by canon. They are guided by what the author wrote. So yes, any literary work, when it's established and when it's born from a literary source, that is the canon. What the author wrote's the canon. And even if he changed his ideas, all those ideas are still canon. Any adaptation, that's not canon. But those can be accepted by fans and audiences as additions if they are guided by the canon. And they are called adaptations because they are adapting those stories in a different format. But the authoritative version, the original version, is the author's stories, the author's version of events. So Tolkien's versions of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, that's the canon. That's the original story. That's the definitive version of how those events unfolded. And again, same thing with Dune. What Frank Herbert wrote, that's the definitive version of how events unfolded in the Dune saga. Rings of Power is not an adaptation, and it is not guided by canon. So it is not accepted by fans. It is not the same thing. And they even say this. Amazon has admitted, for one, that they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, all those other published posthumous works. They don't have the rights to that. So they're not telling those stories. They say it's inspired by Tolkien. It's inspired by his characters. It's based on those things, but it is not an adaptation. So you cannot justify what Rings of Power is doing just because the author changed his mind on a couple things. There might be some possible versions of canon for some few specific things. I would accept them going with either. So in regards to the wizards, just because Tolkien had other versions of ideas, that in itself doesn't give Amazon, the Rings of Powers, the showrunners, to then dismiss all of Tolkien's ideas and versions. They are using that as justification for bastardizing his work and not being faithful to its lore and characters. I actually looked up the definition of what is canon when it comes to fiction. The definition of which, when it comes to canon and fiction, is the body of works taking place in a particular fictional world that are widely considered to be official or authoritative, especially those created by the original author or developer of the world. So yes, there is canon in Tolkien. Simply put. So if the Rings of Power showrunners had decided to not include wizards in their Second Age show, that would have been in keeping with canon, because that is what Tolkien had written in that one version, that all 5 wizards arrived in the Third Age. On the other hand, if they also had decided to include the 2 blue wizards who were in the East, and Tolkien did later come to and write that they came in the Second Age earlier, if they had decided to include the 2 blue wizards for that storyline, for an Eastern storyline, that would have been in keeping with canon as well, because both of those things were from the author himself. So since Tolkien did write that the 2 blue wizards were sent to Middle-earth in the Second Age, the time period that the Rings of Power show is set in, if they would have been featured, that would have been expected and even applauded by fans. Corey Olsen, even after the season 1 finale aired, and even though they had dialogue from Gandalf being spoken by the stranger, the fact that he was going east, he still held out hope that the stranger was a blue wizard. I remember him saying this. And other fans were hopeful too that the stranger would turn out to be a blue wizard. And the reason they had hope for that to begin with is because of canon. It's because of what Tolkien had written. What Tolkien had written guided fans' hopes and expectations. And the ultimate tragedy here is that a blue wizard storyline could have been really interesting. It could have been a fascinating storyline to explore Sauron's schemes and influence on the eastern and southern regions of Middle-earth. Canonically, they were successful in preventing the forces of the East and South from outnumbering those of the Free Peoples in the West, and during that time they became known as Marinatar and Romostamo, meaning Darkness Slayer and East Helper. And they were instrumental in weakening Sauron's operations, which contributed to his defeat at the end of the Second Age in the War of the Last Alliance. That could have been so cool to see and explore and flesh out those characters. We already know full well Gandalf's storyline, and that would be considered hard canon if you consider it that way. Like anything that was published while Tolkien was still alive, that would be considered hard canon. But like for these other things, and again, published works that were collected after, like posthumously, that could be soft canon. But still, that would still be accepted by fans because that's what Tolkien wrote. For me, there are the hard canon books J.R.R. himself published, and soft canon, the books his son and longtime editor published after his death. And either way, it's still canon at the end of the day, because he did write those things. And even the soft canon stuff, I think people would have accepted if it didn't conflict with the hard canon, I guess. So that's some leeway there. But yes, hard canon, stuff that was written while he was alive, that's untouchable. Of course, there are deviations in Tolkien's lore because he kept elaborating it all his life. Simple solution, don't contradict anything he wrote. Just because he revisited some things and later wanted to flesh things out more, because for the longest time he didn't mention much at all about the two blue wizards. So it seems he wanted specifically to return to that and flesh out some more of their background. That's interesting, that's cool. But again, that in itself does not justify Amazon's complete dismissal of all of his ideas.